For what purposes does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 156 as amended, a resolution calling for accountability and justice for the assassination of Boris Nemtsov.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 156, resolution calling for accountability and justice for the assassination of Boris Nemtsov.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, and the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kissinger, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York.
I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on House Resolution 156 as amended, a resolution calling for accountability and justice for the assassination of Boris Nemtsov under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Madam Speaker, at this time, I ask unanimous consent to include in the congressional record an exchange of letters between me and the chairman of the Committee on Ways and Means on House Resolution 156 as amended.
Without objection, so ordered.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in strong support of this resolution. I'm proud to have authored this measure with my colleague, Mr. McCall, the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. The measure before us today condemns the assassination of Boris Nemtsov. Nemtsov was a brave advocate for democracy in Russia, calling for free elections and an end to the massive corruption at the Kremlin. I remember when he visited here, and I had him in my office. We took pictures just the other day. We were looking at them. He certainly was a champion of freedom in Russia, and for it met his demise. The fact that he was calling for free elections and an end to the massive corruption in the Kremlin put him right in Vladimir Putin's crosshairs. Now he joins a long list of brave journalists, human rights activists, and political opponents murdered by Putin's henchmen in their quest to silence all criticism of the Kremlin and stamp out any perceived threat to Putin's authoritarian regime. When I met Boris Nemtsov here in Washington in my office, he talked about his vision for a Russia freed from Putin's grip on power, with open, fair elections, independent media, and a strong civil society. In the words of John McCain, Boris Nemtsov, and I quote, would not be oppressed by unjust laws or violence or by violence and fear. He lived for love and justice and truth, unquote. He was incredibly brave to take on these issues in a country where opposition to Putin often amounts to a death sentence. Just a few months after our conversation, as I mentioned before, he was murdered in cold blood in Moscow. Now it's been 4 years since his death, but there's been no proper investigation of his assassination and the cover-up and zero accountability for those responsible. That's certainly an outrage. This resolution condemns the Kremlin's systematic targeting of its political opponents and calls on the administration to impose sanctions on those responsible for Nemtsov's murder and cover-up. It also requires the administration to deliver to Congress a thorough report on Nemtsov's assassination. That's a critical part of this legislation because, sadly, the administration, in my opinion, hasn't done nearly enough to stand up to Russia and call out Putin's thuggery. So it's up to Congress to assert American leadership on this issue. I strongly support this bipartisan, bicameral measure, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for such time as he may consume.
Madam Speaker, I rise today in strong support of HRES 156, which I was proud to co-sponsor, calling for justice in the 2015 murder of Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov. On the evening of Friday, February 27, 2015, Boris Nemtsov was shot in the back and killed by cowards just outside of the Kremlin in Moscow. Mr. Nemtsov was an important figure in Russia because he stood up to Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation as he called for democracy in a country dominated by oppression. Before his assassination, Mr. Nemtsov was planning to run for president in 2018 against Vladimir Putin. One can only think of what Russia's future could have been today with Mr. Nemtsov as its leader. Since that day in February 2015, suspects have been charged and sentenced for murder, but we still don't have all the answers or truly know why Mr. Nemtsov was killed. However, we do know that there's never been any questioning of additional suspects or any investigation into evidence that the convicted gunman was a member of a Russian unit that was stationed and backed by Chechnyan dictator and thug Ramzan Kadyrov. Furthermore, Russia continues to put up roadblocks to outside investigators from the European Union and the OSCE to prevent more investigations into the sequence of events that fateful night. 4 years after his murder, Boris Nemtsov and his family are still without answers or the justice that they deserve. The House resolution uses the voice of Congress to hold his killers and their accomplices accountable. Specifically, this resolution condemns the Putin regime for targeting political opponents and using the Russian government to cover up the murder of Mr. Nemtsov. It also calls on the U.S. government to use its capabilities to identify those who support the murderers and to impose strict sanctions for their actions. Last February, on the anniversary of his death, we saw a fitting tribute to Mr. Nemtsov's calls for freedom and democracy when the streets in front of the Russian embassy here in Washington was renamed the Boris Nemtsov Plaza. We can take another important step towards justice by passing this important resolution, and I thank my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for bringing this up in such a bipartisan way. Madam Speaker, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Illinois reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from New York.
It's now my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to a gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski, who is a very new and valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Engel, and thank you to my friends on the other side for leading on this important resolution. When Boris Nemtsov was gunned down 4 years ago on a bridge just a few hundred feet from the Kremlin, we saw once again what a dangerous place Putin's Russia is for anybody with the courage to speak truth to power. We saw again that while Russia has fierce and formidable security agencies that will track down anyone who dares criticize the Kremlin anywhere in the world, when one of those critics is killed, somehow they can never find the killer. We know that whoever gave the order to kill Boris Nemtsov, one man, Vladimir Putin, is responsible for building a state where those who champion freedom are always punished and those who kill them never are. This resolution says that we will always remember Boris Nemtsov and the truth about what happened to him and who is responsible. It urges the Russian government to hold accountable the authors of the crime and says that until that happens, we will sanction them under the Magnitsky Act. It singles out Ramzan Kadyrov, the brutal ruler of Chechnya, as a key player in the crime and urges the administration to ensure that he can no longer do business anywhere outside Russia. By passing this resolution, we will make clear that you can kill a man, but not the ideas that he fought for, that a good person who lived and died for a good cause will be honored for all time, while the people who killed him will go down in history, if they are remembered at all, as utterly worthless. And we will be saying something else very important, that the United States is not in conflict with Russia or with the Russian people. On the contrary, we are in solidarity with the vast majority of Russians who, like Boris Nemtsov, want a country that is free of corruption, a country where nobody is above the law. Our argument is only with the leaders who deny them that. But those leaders won't be around forever. Boris Nemtsov's legacy will outlast them, and so will our desire to partner with a Russia that shares his values and vision. I yield back.
Gentleman from Illinois.
Madam Speaker, I'm prepared to close. May I inquire as to how many more speakers the majority has?
No other speakers. You can say no other speakers.
Okay,
Gentleman
we
from
have
New
no
York.
other speakers.
Gentleman from New York.
We have no other speakers, and I'm prepared to, I guess, reserve and let the gentleman close.
Madam Speaker, I'll yield myself such time as I can make
Gentleman is
consume.
recognized for such time as he may consume.
Madam Speaker, in closing, I want to thank Chairman Engel and the ranking member, Mr. McCall, for offering up this important resolution, which seeks justice for Boris Nemtsov's brutal murder. At a time when we're seeing the Russian people protesting tighter restrictions on their access to the internet, we should not forget the brave leadership of Mr. Nemtsov, a man who stood up to the oppressors in Russia and advocated bravely for freedom. We should honor his memory by continuing to seek justice for his assassination. It's also important to note, Madam Speaker, the strong bipartisan showing in this chamber of really any Russian resolution that comes up, because we are united, as the prior speaker said, with the Russian people in fighting oppression, as we have for so long and we will continue to do. I urge all members to support this legislation, and with that, Madam Speaker, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman has yielded back the balance of his time. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In closing, let me say it's critical that we speak out against strong men and dictators throughout the world. We need to demand justice for those unable to do so themselves. As we've mentioned, Boris Nemtsov was brutally murdered for bravely standing up to Putin and his corrupt regime. The Kremlin has been complicit in covering up the assassination and failing to conduct a proper investigation. By passing this measure, we show Putin, his cronies, and dictators throughout the world that the U.S. Congress is watching and we will not stay silent. So I strongly support this resolution. I urge my colleagues to join me, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 156 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, on that vote, I request the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays have been requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 596, the Crimea Annexation Non-Recognition Act, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of this bill.
H.R. 596, a bill to prohibit United States government recognition of Russia's annexation of Crimea.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, and the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kissinger, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York.
I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 596, the Crimea Annexation Non-Recognition Act, as amended, under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for such time as he may consume.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Let me thank this bill's author, who is a valued member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, Mr. Connolly of Virginia. Let me also thank our ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for working with us on this bipartisan legislation. Madam Speaker, Vladimir Putin has left no doubt about his intentions to expand Russian influence, undermine democracy, and splinter the alliances and agreements that have long kept Russia in check. We've seen this through Russia's direct attacks on democratic institutions, including our own. Remember the presidential election of 2016. Through a pernicious and widespread misinformation campaign designed to distort reality and foment confusion, and in no clearer way through its illegal occupation of parts of Ukraine and parts of Georgia. It's shocking in the 21st century to see a country trample on a neighbor's sovereignty and seize territory by force. It goes against everything we've worked for since World War II to build a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace. It's been 5 years since Russian forces moved into Crimea and staged a sham election in an attempt to give their occupation a gloss of legitimacy. But there's nothing legitimate about it, absolutely nothing. The United States must never accept Putin's attempts to seize territory by force, and this legislation would enshrine into our laws a non-recognition of Russia's annexation of Crimea. This bill would prevent our government from taking any action that even implies American recognition of this blatantly illegal land grab. This bill also sends a strong message to our Ukrainian friends that we stand shoulder to shoulder with them as they continue to resist Russian efforts to fracture their country. This is especially important in light of recent events in which the Russian Navy intercepted Ukrainian patrol boats in Ukrainian waters, capturing the vessels and their crew by force. Vladimir Putin is a bully, and a thug. His troops may hold Crimea in a stranglehold, but we need to be clear that Crimea will always be part of Ukraine, not part of Russia. This measure will put that rejection permanently into our laws. I'm pleased to support it. I ask all members to do likewise, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for such time as he may consume.
Madam Speaker, I rise today with the majority also in strong support of H.R. 596, the Crimea Annexation Non-Recognition Act. I'm proud to co-sponsor this legislation, which clearly states that America will not recognize the Russian sovereignty over Crimea. Ukraine continues to face significant challenges from Russia, from their meddling and from their aggression. In Congress, we know the true intentions of Vladimir Putin when it comes to Ukraine. Vladimir Putin and his cronies in the Kremlin are tearing Europe apart. Russian-backed separatists continue their shelling of Ukrainian military positions in eastern Ukraine, which has killed civilians in many areas. Additionally, Russia recently violated Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity when it fired upon and captured 3 Ukrainian naval vessels and 24 sailors. Russia continues to hold these sailors on bogus charges that they violated Russian borders, even though the strait is determined to be neutral waters. While Russia maintains that the Ukrainian soldiers were threatening the construction of the Crimean Bridge, which is currently under construction between the territory of Russia and Crimea, we know this is fake news from Putin and his thugs. We need to continue to send a strong message to the Russians that the United States does not, will not recognize their claim of sovereignty over Crimea, not now and not ever. I commend Secretary Pompeo for making the Crimea Declaration last July that articulated this policy of the United States, and I believe Congress should have a voice in this as well. Madam Speaker, the bill is simple. It states that the policy of the United States government is to never recognize sovereignty over Crimea, and it prohibits all U.S. government agencies from taking any action with respect to acknowledging that Russia has any claims over the territory. As Vladimir Putin seeks to impose his iron-fisted will over former Soviet republics, we must continue to stand with our allies to counter that aggression. I want to commend the work of my friend from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, and my friend from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, for their leadership on this issue. By reaffirming congressional support for Ukraine's territorial integrity, and by holding Russia accountable for its continued violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, I believe we will continue to stand with Ukraine legislatively and most effectively from here and into the future. With that, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, it's now my pleasure to yield 5 minutes to the author of this bill, the gentleman from Virginia, a very valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Connolly.
The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the Speaker, and I want to thank my dear friend, the distinguished chairman of our committee, Mr. Engel, for his support. I want to thank my dear friend from Illinois, the Republican manager today, for his support. And I want to salute my friend from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, who has steadfastly co-sponsored this resolution in previous Congresses to make a powerful bipartisan statement. I rise today, Madam Speaker, in support of H.R. 596, the Crimea Annexation Non-Recognition Act, which we introduced together, as I said, with Mr. Shabbat of Ohio. This bill states unequivocally that it's the policy of the United States not to recognize the Russian Federation's claim of sovereignty over Crimea, its airspace, or its territorial waters. Furthermore, the bill prohibits the United States government from taking any action that could possibly imply recognition of Russian sovereignty over Crimea. Putin's forcible and illegal annexation of Crimea, the first forcible seizure of territory in Europe since World War II, undermines Ukrainian sovereignty and threatens the stability of Europe. Acquiescence on the part of the United States would threaten the security of all sovereign nations. Who's next? Moldova? Georgia? The Baltic states? It is the long-standing policy of our country not to recognize territorial changes elected by force, as dictated by the Stimson Doctrine, established in 1932 by then Republican Secretary of State Henry Stimson under a Republican President Herbert Hoover. We upheld that doctrine with the issuance of the Wells Declaration in 1940, which stated emphatically that the U.S. would not recognize the illegal annexation at that time of the Baltic states by the Soviet Union. That policy remained in effect for 50 long years. Some thought it quixotic. For more than those 50 years, we stood by those Baltic republics of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, sometimes in the face of ridicule. Today, they are independent nations and members of the NATO alliance. The collective wisdom of the previous and current administrations, Congress, our European allies, and the American public is that similar principles must be adopted with respect to Crimea. Crimea was Putin's original violation in the Ukraine, and we have limited credibility objecting to Russia's subsequent invasion of the Luhansk and Donetsk areas of that country if we do not take a stand with respect to Crimea. Then we're just quibbling over the price. What has happened in Ukraine, Russia's forcible and illegal annexation of Crimea, invasion of the eastern part of the country, and continued occupation, has precipitated an international crisis, and the resulting conflict has claimed more than 10,000 lives. Russia has subjected Crimeans who refuse Russian citizenship to discrimination in accessing education, health care, and employment, and Russian authorities have attacked travel rights and the free press. The matter of rejecting the forcible and illegal attack on sovereign territory is so important we should be satisfied with nothing less than absolute clarity about our position, which is that we support Ukraine's sovereignty over Crimea. The Obama administration established a non-recognition policy towards Russian sovereignty over Crimea and levied sanctions against individuals and entities enabling Russia's illegal occupation. Our allies in Europe have stood with us, shoulder to shoulder, in emphasizing and enforcing those sanctions. Congress codified the Obama Crimea sanctions and has repeatedly used the power of the purse to prohibit the use of government funds for any action that could possibly recognize de jure or de facto the illegal annexation of Crimea. The FY 2016 National Defense Authorization Act included similar language to that contained in our bill today in order to prohibit the use of defense funds in a manner that could possibly be construed as recognition of Russian sovereignty over Crimea. That language has remained in the NDAA ever since. And in countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act, Congress reiterated its support for the Stimson's Doctrine and its application to the illegal invasions by Russia and occupations of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia, Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and the Transnistria region in Moldova. The United States must lead the way in refusing to recognize or legitimize Russia's illegal acts and its forcible annexation of Crimea. That's why I am so proud to offer this bill, along with Mr. Chabot, that expresses the will of Congress as loud and as clear as we can. And I urge my colleagues unanimously to support it. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Illinois, Ms. Kinzinger.
Madam Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Chabot, senior member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and the primary co-sponsor of this bill.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 596, the Crimea Annexation Non-Recognition Act, and I want to thank my good friend from Virginia, Representative Jerry Connolly, for his work and his leadership on this legislation and many other pieces of legislation that we've worked on in a bipartisan manner in this House. They say there's no bipartisanship here, whether it's under Democratic or Republican control, and we found a way to make that happen on the Foreign Affairs Committee over the years. As a senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the principal Republican co-sponsor of this legislation, let me state clearly and emphatically that the United States, and the world for that matter, must never recognize Vladimir Putin's reckless Crimean land grab, which is all too reminiscent of Soviet Cold War tactics. This bill not only definitively sets out U.S. policy that we will not recognize Putin's bogus claims of sovereignty over Crimea, but it will also prohibit our government from taking any actions that might imply our recognition of Russian claims. Representative Connolly and I first introduced this legislation back in 2014, shortly after Putin seized Crimea. Despite the intervening years, we must never grow accustomed to Russian control over the peninsula, and that's one reason it makes this legislation even more vitally necessary, because over time, the world sometimes does grow accustomed to things. We must never let that happen with Putin's grab of Crimea. Last May, Putin opened a bridge over the Kerch Strait, which separates Russia from Crimea, in an attempt to better link the two, to grab it and keep it. The bridge is too low for many large vessels, which has reduced economic activity at Ukrainian ports on the Sea of Azov, thus further harming Ukraine. Even more concerning, in November, Putin's thugs illegally seized 3 Ukrainian naval vessels and their crews at the entrance to the Kerch Strait. Plain and simple, Putin's illegal annexation of Crimea, as well as his adventures around the Kerch Strait and in eastern Ukraine, have no place in a modern democratic Europe. We must not abandon Ukraine to Putin's bullying. That's why I'm pleased to co-sponsor this legislation along with my friend, Mr. Connolly, which is but a step towards, once again, a free Crimea. I urge my colleagues to support it so that we will never recognize Russian domination over the Crimean Peninsula. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I continue to reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Illinois.
I have no more speakers. I'm prepared to close you. Okay. Madam Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized for such time as he may consume.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter to the record February 27th, 2019 statement by Secretary Pompeo on Crimea and Ukraine.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just to quote a paragraph of that, the Secretary writes, in the Crimea Declaration of July 25, 2018, the United States reaffirmed its refusal to recognize the Kremlin's claims of sovereignty over Crimea. The United States also condemns Russia's illegal actions in Crimea and its continued aggression against Ukraine. The United States will maintain respective sanctions against Russia until the Russian government returns control of Crimea to Ukraine and fully implements the Minsk agreements. The United States reiterates its unbending support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, including its territorial waters. Madam Speaker, in our history, we've always seen the impact that our nation has on others. When we stand up, we help them achieve a better tomorrow. We must continue to help Ukraine achieve that better future for its citizens, particularly one that is free from Russian aggression. Recently, we sent the USS Donald Cook to transit through the Kerch Straits as a show of solidarity with Ukraine. Actions like these and support for this bill will further send the message to Vladimir Putin that the U.S. will never waver in our support for those who seek to push back against Russian oppression and coercion and coerced influence. This is a great bill that shows the unity between, again, Republicans and Democrats in this House, the legislative body, and the administration. I urge all members to support this legislation, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, in closing, let me say that we need to take a strong stand against Vladimir Putin and his aggressive behavior in Eastern Europe. This legislation would reaffirm in American law, that Russia's annexation of Crimea is illegal and that the United States will never recognize its legitimacy. I hope the other body will act on this measure soon after we pass it, and I hope the administration will signal its willingness to sign this legislation. There are too many questions swirling around when it comes to Russia, too many times that we don't seem to be calling Vladimir Putin out for what he's done. And I just think that it's something that we really need to look at very, very carefully. And I would hope the White House would do that. Signing this bill will not put these concerns to rest. but it would help show that the United States won't just roll over and accept Russia's land grabs and egregious violations of international law. I want to thank the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for his work on this bill. I want to thank the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Chabot, for his work on the bill. I'm happy to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 596 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative. Gentleman from Virginia.
Madam Speaker, on this, I would request the ayes and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1404.
The clerk will report the title of the bill. Does the gentlelady wish to bring up the bill as amended?
Yes.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1404, a bill to strengthen the United States response to Russian interference by providing transparency on the corruption of Russian President Vladimir Putin.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days.
The gentlelady will suspend. Rule, the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Demings, and the gentleman from New York, the gentlewoman from New York, is recognized, Ms. Stefani. Each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection. So ordered.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized for such time as she may consume.
Madam Speaker, every American has the right to a secure democracy where their voice matters. As members of Congress, our national security must be a top priority. We must investigate and expose Russia's financial networks and cut off any illegal funding that supports criminal attacks against the United States of America. This bipartisan legislation is a crucial first step to ensure that the rights of the American people matter more than dark and corrupt Russian money. It's been said that money talks, but it's our job to keep it from speaking over the American people. Last week, the House of Representatives passed H.R. 1, historic reforms to get big money out of politics. But we haven't done nearly enough to prevent foreign powers and foreign money from attacking our democracy. Russia, the country that once had the ability to provide a decent life for its people, have chosen to strip their wealth as they watch their wealth disappear overseas into hidden accounts. These corrupt oligarchs are a cautionary tale on how working people can be cheated if left unchecked. This corrupt band of individuals, led by Vladimir Putin, have mounted a massive asymmetric attack against the United States. America has the greatest military in the world. But the Russians have figured out that if they have any chance at victory, they must fight us another way, undermine our elections, spread fear and unrest, and sow discord through racism and other divisive tactics. What they don't understand, Madam Speaker, is that we take pride in our democracy. We may have policy differences. We might have policy disagreements, sometimes quite strongly, but we all know that our democratic form of government, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, is our greatest strength and weapon against any foe. We do believe in this country that every voice matters. Foreign nationals are banned from contributing to U.S. elections, but multiple Kremlin-connected Americans have funneled millions of dollars into political action, yielding massive influence in our democracy, and Vladimir Putin is the king of this corrupt money. Putin's protests are generally delivered in a smirk and an accusation of fake news, but his discomfort with revealing his assets is clearly simmering below the surface. It's telling that Ms. Stefanik and I, when we introduced this legislation, we were both attacked by Russian state media. What is Putin afraid of? Perhaps the former KGB or operative is well aware of the poor long-term prospects for gangsters and autocrats who are unmasked before their impoverished countrymen. Are his fears uncovering his shadowy networks that prop up dictators and human rights abusers around the world in his quest to subvert the world order? Likely he and his cronies are desperate to obscure their billions in an attempt to shield themselves from sanctions. But, Madam Speaker, no matter the root of his fear, our obligation is to shine a light on his illicit networks. It's time that we hold him accountable. This legislation will expose the corrupt finances being used to fund attacks against our democracy. Madam Speaker, in closing, I call upon the words of our 35th president. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, and oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty. Madam Speaker, I urge the passage of this legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves the balance of her time. The gentlelady from New York, Ms. Stefanik, is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
You're recognized for such time as you may consume.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today, I rise in strong support of H.R. 1404, the Vladimir Putin Transparency Act. According to the 2017 Intelligence Community Assessment produced by the CIA, NSA, and FBI, and an indictment issued by the Attorney General in 2018, it is clear that Russian actors conspired to interfere and influence U.S. political processes and the presidential election in 2016. This assessment stated that Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the U.S. presidential election. Russia's goals were to undermine public faith in the U.S. democratic process. Madam Speaker, the Russian government has been known to employ a system of corruption and illicit financial ties as a tool for consolidating its domestic political control and projecting power abroad to weaken not only the United States, but other democratic countries as well. That is why I proudly co-sponsored H.R. 1404. The bill would require that within 180 days of enactment, the Director of National Intelligence, in coordination with the Secretary of Treasury and the Secretary of State, shall submit a congressional report on the personal net worth and assets owned by Russian President Vladimir Putin. The report would also include accounts, holdings, shell companies, and intermediaries, and identify senior Russian political figures and oligarchs who facilitate corrupt practices. Vladimir Putin and his corrupt allies seek to weaken democracies globally by consolidating political control through unethical means, and they must be brought to account for their actions. This bipartisan legislation is an important step to ensuring the security of our elections and upholding democracy around the world. And I urge my colleagues to support this common sense bill. I also want to thank my colleague, Representative Val Demings, for her leadership on this issue. I am proud to work across the aisle with her to pass this important bill. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves the balance of her time. The gentlelady from Florida.
Madam Speaker, I have no additional speakers. I'm ready to close.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentlelady from New York.
I'm ready to close as well. No additional speakers.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, as I noted in my remarks, this is important bipartisan legislation. It is about transparency. It is about accountability. It is about standing up to the corrupt practices of Russian President Vladimir Putin. This is bipartisan common sense legislation, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill on the floor.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In closing, H.R. 1404 will shine a light on Vladimir Putin's financial networks that have stripped the Russian Federation of its resources and left the Russian people in poverty. It will also empower Congress, the intelligence community, and our allies to crack down on cross-border corruption. I want to thank my colleague on the Intelligence Committee, Representative Stefanik, for joining me in this important legislation. Additionally, I want to thank the hardworking staff on both sides of the aisle, on the Intelligence Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee, for their input on this critical legislation. With that, Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1404 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Let's do it easier. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1617.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1617, a bill to direct the Director of National Intelligence to submit intelligence assessments of the intentions of the political leadership of the Russian Federation and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Krishnamurti, and the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 1617. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for such time as he may consume.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 1617, the Keeping Russian Entrapments Minimal and Limiting Intelligence Networks Act, or the Kremlin Act. The intelligence community is united in its assessment that Russia attempted to sabotage the 2016 U.S. election and that America is not alone in facing these dangers and attacks. In fact, recent reports indicate that Russia continues to engage in information warfare and political interference in the West that threatens the health of democratic institutions within member countries of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO. Among many examples, the Russian Federation is linked to cyber crimes in Ukraine and Germany, disinformation campaigns here in the United States, intelligence support for pro-Russian Bulgarian candidates, and financing for pro-Russian parties in France. The bipartisan Kremlin Act, which I introduced with my friend Congressman Chris Stewart of Utah, acknowledges the active threat of foreign interference on the United States and our NATO allies. Specifically, this legislation would require the Director of National Intelligence to submit 3 intelligence assessments to Congress. These assessments must analyze, first, potential military action by Russia against members of NATO, second, potential responses by Russia to an enlarged U.S. or NATO presence in Eastern Europe, and third, potential areas where the Russian government could exploit weaknesses and divisions among the governments of NATO and her allies. Most importantly, the Kremlin Act recognizes that Russian meddling with our allied NATO countries constitutes a direct threat to the United States. By providing the appropriate congressional committees with these comprehensive assessments, we will be better prepared to thwart efforts in the future that aim to weaken international democratic institutions. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume, which, by the way, won't be much.
The gentleman is recognized for such time as he may consume.
Thank you. I rise in favor of H.R. 1617, and I'm proud to co-sponsor this bill with my friend, Mr. Krishnamurthy. The Keeping Russian Entrapments Minimal and Limiting Intelligence Network Acts, also known as the Kremlin Act, is a common-sense bill that directs the intelligence community to conduct assessments on the leadership of Russian government's plans and intentions, as my friend Raja has said, especially in regards to NATO. Madam Speaker, with some questioning Washington's commitment to the transatlantic alliance, this bill also serves as a reminder to our allies of the U.S. Congress's commitment to NATO. NATO is indispensable. As a former military officer, I know firsthand how true that is. It is also as important today as it has ever been. And understanding the threats that the Kremlin continues to challenge to this important alliance is of the utmost importance. In particular, the bill seeks assessments in 3 areas. First, any potential military action against NATO members. Second, potential reaction to the expansion of NATO. And finally, potential weaknesses in areas of division against NATO allies. Learning the Russian government's intentions in these areas will better enable the United States government to counter any attempts to undermine this critical alliance that we call NATO. I'd like to thank the Speaker, urge passage of H.R. 1617, and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
We have no further speakers and are prepared to close.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Utah.
And I'm prepared to close as well, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Well, once again, very briefly, this is a common sense piece of legislation. It's a bipartisan piece of legislation. Importantly, it improves our national security. It improves the ability of our intelligence agencies to do the critical work that they do. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart, yields the balance of his time. Now the gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Madam Speaker, for the health of our democracy, I strongly urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan Kremlin Act. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman now yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1617 as amended? Those opposed? As is. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed? In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.